You have a suite of Trump administration policies that not only lower our standards of living, but are designed to lower our standards of living so that we can be the sort of people who are putting iPhones together. It's crazy. It is not what U.S. workers and consumers want. And as you start seeing the deterioration in standards of living, which will come from the weaker dollar that buys fewer products, that you can see forecasted in the stock market, that will arise because businesses, they don't know what to invest in, they can't expand, they can't grow, they can't hire, that's going to be really unpopular. And I think that it hasn't really settled in for people that this is what the administration is trying to do.
All right, he writes a very serious newsletter on Substack and co-hosts the legal podcast Serious Trouble with Popat, a.k.a. Ken White. It is Josh Barro, also fresh off Coachella. So we'll see how well our brains are popping for you guys today.
I'm doing great, Tim.
You're at 100?
I'm totally refreshed.
Really? Oh, yeah. I'm happy for you. Yeah. What did you do yesterday? Did you get a massage or something? Some green juice?
No, I took 2 flights. I flew back I drove to the Inland Empire from Coachella and then flew through Salt Lake City to New York.
Okay. Well,
nice Delta Airlines day.
Start chugging that coffee then. All right. I want to get into a little bit on the tariffs, and you had an op-ed in the New York Times that offered a similar critique to one that I had of Chris Deluzio, who's also on the podcast today. So I want to get into that. But first, I just want to talk a little bigger picture about what's going on with the economy.
Sure.
You had a tweet the other day that I liked, and it said, "My number one recession indicator is normies ask me questions about the bond market." So for all of us normies, what is happening in the bond market, and what does it say about a recession?
Yeah, well, so I mean, first of all, to talk about what is supposed to happen in the bond market when things go wrong. I mean, normally when there's a crisis around the world, the U.S. dollar will strengthen and interest rates on U.S. government bonds will fall, and both of those are because of flight to quality. Basically, people, they don't know what's happening, they're concerned about future economic prospects, they want to be in the safest thing possible, and normally the safest thing possible is U.S. Treasury bonds and the U.S. dollar. There was also an expectation that the dollar would strengthen if we started imposing tariffs, because that's what happened last time around when the Trump administration imposed tariffs specifically on China. And the idea there is, if you impose tariffs, we are not importing as much as we would have otherwise. So we're not sending as many dollars abroad. And so basically other countries, in order to get dollars to buy things from us or to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, they have to get them from somewhere. They basically have to bid up the price of the dollars. There was this expectation that we would impose these tariffs and the dollar would strengthen. And Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, was going around telling people that this would happen. He said in his confirmation hearing that, people say Americans will pay the tariffs, but, because the dollar will strengthen, Americans will be able to buy more than they could before because the dollar will have more purchasing power, and that will offset maybe 40% of the cost of the tariffs, is what he told members of the U.S. Senate when he was seeking his confirmation. What has actually happened, if you've been paying attention to the bond market, and it's increasingly people are paying attention to the bond market, which is unfortunate, is that first the interest rates on Treasury bonds fell sharply, but then they rose very sharply, starting about a week and a half ago, Friday. And the reasons that interest rates would go up in a crisis like this are basically that investors don't feel good about the United States. They want to get into safer investments. Bonds are safer than stocks, but they're also concerned about growth prospects in the United States. They could even be concerned about the creditworthiness of the U.S. government. You have the president going around breaking all sorts of agreements, trade agreements, laws that are supposed to bind the executive, that sort of thing. There are some wacky ideas that have been floated by Steve Myron, who runs the Council on Economic Advisors in the White House, that you could argue about whether or not they would constitute a default on U.S. government bonds. So for a number of reasons, it could be.
What are some of those wacky ideas? Like, what's an example?
It was literally that we would impose a quote unquote fee on foreign holders of U.S. government bonds. Basically that, we'd say, the interest rate this bond is supposed to be paying is 4%, but we're going to withhold 15% of that because, we're not happy with your trade practices. We think you hold too many bonds, et cetera. And he basically says in this paper that he published before the administration came in, before he received the CEA job, said, well, people could call that a default on Treasury bonds, but there's already taxes on interest income on bonds. So is it really that different from that? I don't think the market would be as sanguine about that. Anyway, I want to be clear, the administration hasn't done this yet. This is just something that Steve Myron put in a paper. But I think that, given the lawlessness of this administration and the wacky things that they have surprised people by doing, I think concerns about whether there's going to be a future effort to monkey with the repayment on our bonds is something reasonable. But I think the bigger concern, actually, and probably the other reason why the dollar is falling, in addition to interest rates rising, is just that what they're doing is terrible for the U.S. economy and terrible for growth. And so one reason people might want to hold U.S. dollars is, I think they're safe, I want to hold them. But another reason people would hold U.S. dollars is, I expect to do business in the United States. I need to send money to my subsidiary in the U.S. so it can build a factory there. That kind of thing. I mean, that's what the tariffs are theoretically supposed to do. They're supposed to draw investment into the U.S. and say, well, gee, if you want to make widgets, you better make them in the U.S. so you can sell them in the U.S. without tariffs. But what's actually happening, what seems to actually be happening is other countries are looking at our policies and saying, not only are tariffs going to be higher, I don't know how much higher because the president won't tell me what the tariff policy is going to be. That's not drawing people to put in the factory because, the tariff on widgets might be 25% tomorrow, but in 4 years, it might be zero again. I'm not going to stand up a widget factory that's only going to come online right when Donald Trump is supposed to be about to leave office. And so it's basically freezing investment in the United States. It's making Europe look attractive as a place to invest relative to the U.S., which, is not something that you could really say for decades. And so that's, I think, a key reason. Right, exactly. Well, soon they will, because Europe is going to be richer than us. They're going to have air conditioning. They're going to have, the SUVs, all the things that we used to make fun of them for not having. But so I think that, what you see in the markets is that there's an expectation that what they've done is terrible for the U.S. economy. So obviously that shows up in stock prices going down. Corporate profits are expected to be lower than was expected previously. But you also see that in the bond market, because what you're seeing in the bond market and in exchange rates is people are not feeling enthusiastic about investing in the U.S. relative to other countries. The one thing you can do to get away from the uncertainty of Trump's tariff policy is to do something that's completely unrelated to the United States. Say, I'm going to build a factory in Germany and export from Germany to France or to, the Mideast or wherever. And so I always know that the Trump tariff on that activity is going to be zero. That stuff looks a lot more attractive than stuff that involves U.S. trade right now.
Yeah. Let's just talk about that global kind of picture just overall, because it ties like a lot of the early policies of the Trump administration together with the immigration regime, right. What's happening with, the tax on Greenland, like the attempts, the lascivious attempts to, get into Greenland, right. Obviously Ukraine, the Ukraine war, and these tariffs. And what we're seeing is like this picture throughout the world where there's going to be less maybe interest in investing in us, less reliability on security partnerships, less desire to travel and travel to America. We're already seeing from Europe and Canada is way down. People don't want to be hassled about over immigration status, et cetera. They don't want to end up in Natchez prison in Louisiana because they forgot to declare the frog embryos, like the woman that was coming in from Russia. And so like altogether, just how worried are you just about kind of the weakening, like how this sort of weakening of America, is like going to be hard to roll back at this point, because these countries are all making decisions that are irrational to what their interests are, and their interests are no longer as tied to us as they were 3 months ago.
Yeah, I'm worried about it in part because of the long time horizons that these things involve. I mean, for example, the weakening of the security partnerships is pushing Europe to spend more on defense, which is something that, that I have wanted. So I don't think the goal of getting Europe to rearm is actually a bad one. The problem is that when you push them into that, at the same time that you're showing unreliability on all these other dimensions, with Ukraine, for example, and these questions of the usefulness of U.S. weapons systems in Ukraine if the U.S. government decides they don't want Ukraine to be using them anymore. So what does that mean if you're Germany or you're France or you're Denmark and you need to buy fighter planes or you need to buy other defense systems? Do you really want to buy them from Boeing and Lockheed Martin and other U.S. companies where you're concerned that the U.S. government might have some ongoing control over technology or parts or other things that you would need to maintain the usefulness of those defense systems? I mean, that should have been a boon to the U.S. economy. We are a leader in military technology, and U.S. defense contractors ought to make a lot of money if Europe decides it's going to buy a lot more military equipment. But instead, what we're seeing is huge gains in European defense stocks, because you have these European countries saying, not only do I need a stronger military and more equipment for that, but I would really like to find a way to buy it from a non-American manufacturer. I mean, that's a terrible thing for one industry in our economy. And you can see that repeated in other places, where anything that involves having a long-term dependency on U.S. policy, whether that's for defense or whether that's just because you're exposed to the tariff regime, and your investment in a U.S. subsidiary, the entire question of whether it's going to be profitable or not depends on the tariff regime. That just looks very unattractive when U.S. policy is both hostile and uncertain. And so I think partly the long-term effect depends on how people are thinking about the after Trump period. Because so many of these things are, if you're going to build a factory, that's a years-long investment before it starts to produce returns. If people expect that basically this is a weird period and things are going back to normal, then in the long run, maybe that will be fine for the U.S. economy, although we're in for a rough few years. But if on the other hand, it's sending a signal that the U.S. is a permanently less reliable partner, and people are concerned that the next Republican administration could be as wacky and hostile as this one has been, then that makes it hard, even for an administration that's trying to put the pieces back together, to convince people that they should come invest in the United States. They might say, well, now we have a president who doesn't want to, change tariffs every day, but we don't know what the next president's going to do. So even though you've set a tariff policy that should be favorable to investment in the U.S., we don't feel comfortable doing that. Now, there's some things that could be done about that. For example, the very expansive tariff powers that the president has under quite old laws that were not really misused that badly by any presidents up until now with Trump. You could repeal a lot of those powers, and that might make it more credible to say, yeah, we're sorry about what Trump did, but the next guy's not going to do that because he's not even allowed to do it, even if he wanted to. Maybe that sort of thing will work, but it's going to be a real challenge for the next Democratic administration, or even for a subsequent Republican administration that wants to get more integrated into the world system, the damage to our credibility that Trump is doing right now.
Yeah, a couple things in that. I just like to be a consistent, friendly reminder that Don Bacon and Mike Lawler and Brian Fitzpatrick and maybe one other person could make those tariff changes right now if they wanted to. Like that is possible. These people have power. They like to pretend like they don't, but there's a majority in the Congress for this right now.
The president could veto it, though. You would need 2/3 in both houses. I mean, your broader point that Republicans, if they wanted to stop the president, they could, but you'd need a lot more than 4 of them.
Yeah, that is true. But it's not as if there are not signals that could be sent right now that there is opposition to this, besides going on to CNN. I guess that is my point. Right. To the broader European question, I just don't know how it would be rational for our partners in Canada and Europe to view things in the first way that you said, that this is like a 3-year weird thing and that things will go back to normal. I mean, if you just look at it from their perspective, I mean, they're like most of Europe and Canada finds it insane that Donald Trump got back into the White House in the first place and couldn't have possibly imagined it. They are seeing the damage, but up close, much more, in particular with what's happening on the continent. And so, like, I just don't know how they could rationally look at this and say, okay, well, the Americans will get their shit together. Like, what evidence is there that the Americans will get their shit together?
Well, I think that this is all going to be quite politically damaging for the Trump administration. We're already seeing, I think some people are looking at the polls about the president and sort of like being like, how are they not shifting faster? But they're shifting quite quickly. I mean, the president's approval ratings in just, the last couple of weeks have posted a material deterioration. And that's with only the financial market effects of the tariffs. We haven't even really started feeling the real economy effects. I mean, you're going to have all sorts of products that are just getting vastly more expensive as the tariffs roll into force. And that's what's being forecasted in the financial markets, that the real economy is going to face a lot of problems. And you're already seeing people reacting strongly to the fact that stocks are falling. The rise in interest rates, I don't think most people are paying attention to the bond market yet, but that's going to flow through into mortgage rates. It's going to flow through into credit card rates. And I don't think we need to assume that it's going to stop at the, sort of the 4.3, 4.4 on the 10-year Treasury bond that we're at right now. So I think that, if the Trump administration really goes through with a significant increase in the tariff policy and also continues with this absolute uncertainty where it changes from day to day what the tariffs are going to be, I think you're going to have fairly quickly quite damaging effects in the U.S. economy. The president's numbers are going to get worse and worse. I mean, for one thing, that reduces his political fearsomeness that I think we have seen with a lot of the reaction to lawless things that the administration has done. But I think that also increases the likelihood that a future administration is not going to repeat what they're doing.
Yeah, you laid out there something that I just don't think has sunk in with a lot of people yet. I just want to drill down on for a second, which is stagnating or declining economy. And Goldman Sachs now has downgraded. They expected a 3% economic growth this year down to 0.5. So you have a stagnating or declining economy paired not with lower interest rates, like with increasing interest rates,
right,
that are going to affect people's loans on that, and so like even like the silver lining, I guess, or whatever, the positive potentially of a weakening of economy where inflation is going down and there's there's weakening signs is that the Fed lowers interest rates, and then some people get to refi on their houses and stuff because interest rates have been high, at least for the recent period recently. Like right. None of that is going to happen. Like this is a recipe for the economy slowing down and interest rates staying high or going higher.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the other thing that's important to note about the theory of what the Trump administration is doing is it's internally very confused because the things like that paper that I referenced from Steve Myron that had some of these suggestions about what to do about tariffs in a more orderly manner than what the president has actually done. But the argument that from him and from some of the economists around the president has been that you should impose tariffs, and at first that will strengthen the dollar, but what you ultimately want is a weaker dollar. So the dollar wasn't supposed to weaken yet, but they were eventually supposed to have policies that were going to pursue a weaker dollar. And the reason for that was supposed to be that a weaker dollar makes the U.S. a more attractive place to invest and do manufacturing. And that's true in the abstract, because if you have a weaker dollar, it is cheaper if you're a foreign company to pay U.S. workers than to pay foreign workers, because U.S. workers are paid less. And that makes the country a more attractive place to do manufacturing. And this has been a stated objective for them. They say that it's a problem that there's a thing that economists call the exorbitant privilege, which is the idea that the U.S. persistently runs trade deficits that are financed by other people around the world buying U.S. Treasury bonds because they form the basis of the global financial system. Basically, the idea is people in China send us dollars, we send them slips of paper that say U.S. government on them, and then we send the dollars back in order to buy actual goods from them. So basically, they're getting slips of paper, we get goods. We enjoy a dollar that is stronger than it otherwise would be, which means that we get to buy more things with each of our dollars, and we enjoy lower interest rates than we'd otherwise have because other people are lending us money because that's the way they store their money. They store it in U.S. government debt. So that sounds like quite a good thing, and in fact, it is a good thing. It is a thing that creates a higher standard of living in the United States than we would enjoy if we were not the bedrock of the global financial system. Some of the people around Donald Trump explicitly want to pull that apart. They want a weaker dollar, and that would ultimately also imply higher interest rates, even though they don't really talk about the fact that it would cause interest rates to go up. And they want that because it would make the U.S. a more attractive place to do manufacturing. And it's true, but the trade-off there would be a lower standard of living. Americans would have lower incomes. They'd be able to buy fewer products, whether those are domestic or foreign. And other countries have pursued policies like this in the past. This is the sort of policy that some middle-income countries have had as they've been coming up. I mean, they look to places like South Korea and Taiwan that had these export-driven growth through the 1980s, et cetera. But I would rather be the U.S. in 2022 than be Taiwan in 1985. Taiwan was a country that had some good things going for it and was getting richer, but was poorer than the United States. And that's part of why it was an attractive place to do manufacturing. And so they have this weird set of priorities where they'd rather be a good place to manufacture than a good place to live and consume. And as you start seeing that come through for Americans, that you have a suite of Trump administration policies that not only lower our standards of living, but are designed to lower our standards of living so that we can be the sort of people who are putting iPhones together. It's crazy. It is not what U.S. workers and consumers want. And as you start seeing the deterioration in standards of living, which will come from the weaker dollar that buys fewer products, that you can see forecasted in the stock market, that will arise because businesses, they don't know what to invest in. They can't expand. They can't grow. They can't hire. That's going to be really unpopular. And I think that it hasn't really settled in for people that this is what the administration is trying to do.
You know, we got new surprises every day in the marketplace, thanks to Donald Trump. Maybe your tomatoes will be 20% more expensive tomorrow. Who knows? Maybe your electronics will be more expensive or less expensive or more expensive or less expensive. You know, you can't get any certainty these days from our government. So maybe you should look for certainty in other places in life. That's where we turn to today's sponsor, SelectQuote. SelectQuote is one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience helping over 2 million customers find over $700 billion in coverage since 1985. Other life insurance brokers offer impersonal, one-size-fits-all policies that may cost you more and cover you less, while SelectQuote's licensed insurance agents work for you to tailor a life insurance policy for your individual needs in as little as 15 minutes. And if you've ever worried about getting coverage with a pre-existing health condition, SelectQuote partners with carriers that provide policies for a variety of conditions: high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease. Or if you don't have any major health issues, they work with carriers that can get you same-day coverage with no medical exam required. Head to SelectQuote.com, and a licensed insurance agent will call you right away with the right policy for your life and your budget. SelectQuote, they shop, you save. Get the right life insurance for you for less. Go to SelectQuote.com/Bulwark today to get started. That's SelectQuote.com/Bulwark. Hey, YouTube fam, if you want to support the Bulwark, the best way to do it is by becoming a YouTube Bulwark Plus member. The Bulwark is truly independent. We have no corporate overlords. We're not settling any dumb lawsuits with Trump. By joining, you help support our work, and you can get a bunch of perks right here on this platform. Ad-free content, bonus videos, live streams, and some emojis of me, which I guess some people want. So come join, come hang out, become a Bulwark YouTube Plus member, and I'll be seeing you in the comments. So behave. Yeah. What? Just one thing that that made me think about is what's your sense of the the risk level at this point of that advantage that we've held, the U.S. reserve currency, the fact that these countries are storing money in U.S. government bonds. Like, how at risk is that right now of going away for good over the next 4 years?
I mean, a lot of people are quite invested in that system around the world. The cost of changing it is substantial. The Eurozone is not without problems of its own, although I'd probably rather be them than us right now. And so, I don't want people to think that it's gone. Right. And the moves that we've seen in interest rates and in the exchange rate, it's material, but it's not shockingly large. Like, we've gone from 153 yen to $1 to 145 or something like that. This is not outside the range of where these currencies have traded in the past. So I don't want people to think that we are in, that we're already headed into a global economic depression and things can't be turned around. I think what we're seeing from the markets is a significant warning sign. And I think it entails some risk that system could unravel, but I don't think that I don't think it has unraveled yet. I don't think it's set out on an unstoppable path toward unraveling.
But that's not a zero, and it's higher than a 0% chance.
It's higher than zero. I mean,
which is what it was 4 months ago, or 6 months ago.
And this is also, Matt Iglesias makes this point eloquently a lot, which is that there's a lot of things that probably won't happen under Donald Trump, but that are, have a high enough probability of happening that it's very concerning. If a negative event might have happened 10% of the time, that's something you should still concern yourself with, even though you are not forecasting that it is going to happen.
This is how I feel about the Trump third term stuff. I'm like, I don't know. It seems quite unlikely to me, but is it 15% that he tries? Is it 20? Is it 7? 7 is way too high.
He's very old.
He is very old.
I don't know.
He's very,
he can't
very
keep
old.
Doing this forever.
isn't he kind of like, how they always show in the local news, it's like an 108-year-old lady and she's in Alabama and she's been smoking and drinking whiskey her whole life and she's still going, and they're like, what's your secret? And it's like, every morning I have a Maker's Mark. Like, I kind of feel like Trump might be like that, though.
Yeah, I don't know. The reason that lady gets on the news is that she's highly unusual. And the other thing, I mean,
so is Trump, is highly unusual.
Just as a side note, one thing I love about these like super old people stories is that a huge fraction of people who purport to be 110 or something like that, in fact, have just the birth record is wrong, and they are in fact substantially younger than they say they are, or sometimes even substantially younger than they believe they are. There was that woman in France who seemed to be basically defrauding the government out of her mother's pension, and had assumed her mother's identity.
This is such a Josh Barro take. You're like, I want to take the joy from people's Today Show story, like soft news story.
No, I mean, you see
bringing
these things,
facts to this.
Like, some jurisdiction started issuing accurate birth certificates in 1923 or something like that, and then you see that there were way more centenarians purportedly born in 1922 than 1924, that kind of thing. Sorry for being.
That is not sorry. That is just the quintessential Josh Barro aside. So I was happy that we were all here to enjoy it together. Just to cool out the quick tariff things. Just because it is, I forget if I saw you or Iglesias, you're kind of interchangeable in some ways, sharing the story about what's happening with the tomatoes.
Yes.
I do just want to focus on this because it is such a, some of the eggs discourse is kind of silly, but this tomatoes, they announced a 20% tariff on tomatoes coming from Mexico. The Commerce Department did. And their stated argument in defense of this was that the tomatoes coming in from Mexico were too cheap. Yes. And so they have a literal policy of increasing tomato prices for people. Talk to us about that.
Well, so I'd say two things about this. One is that, again, it goes to that they're more focused on that the U.S. should be a good place to grow tomatoes than that the U.S. should be a good place to eat tomatoes. And the vast majority of us do not grow tomatoes. We only eat them. Explicitly, the goal of the policy is to make tomatoes more expensive. What they say is unfair is that the Mexican farmers are selling us tomatoes at too low a price. The tomato price needs to be higher because that will be fair to U.S. farmers. And so, again, this is a policy that is not written with the benefit of the U.S. consumer in mind. The other thing I'd say about it is that this is kind of the least weird part of the Trump trade policy.
Okay.
I mean, lots of administrations have done trade policy like this around things like aluminum and steel, which the Trump administration is doing, but so did George Bush. And Democratic administrations also have taken this position that it's
the shrimpers. We hear about this a lot in Louisiana. There have been a lot of tariffs protecting the shrimpers on and off in the past.
And so the idea that you would impose a tariff to protect a specific U.S. industry from foreign competition is a bad idea. But that's actually one of the trade ideas that Trump does that isn't really unique to him. What's unusual with him is these vast tariffs across all kinds of products, across all kinds of countries that are not aimed at the protection of specific industries. Now, I don't think we should be using tariffs to protect specific industries because I care about the U.S. consumer. But this is one of and this has been a long-running dispute about the tomatoes. This is one of the things that Trump is doing on trade that is actually kind of within the set of bad things that other presidents might do. It's another reason to take away the president's tariff authorities. I don't want tariffs on tomatoes either. But this is, in a way, this is like one of the least norm-breaking parts of the tariff stuff that he's doing.
So that's coming out of the Commerce Department. I'm wondering how you grade Bessent and Lutnick. Are they our worst cabinet secretaries in our life? And I think it's pretty surprising. I guess coming in, I was expecting the worst to be, the TV show host running the military, or like there are a lot of candidates from the last Trump administration, but these two are pretty competitive. Where do you rank them?
I don't know what to make of it. I've sort of been wondering, what would life be like right now if we had Gary Cohn and Steve Mnuchin and Jared back in the Oval Office giving the president good advice. And I think people should realize, by the way, that, as much as you may not like Jared, it's actually worse with him not there than it was with him there.
Yeah, though I made the argument that we wanted it to be worse the first time because the risk of having to do this again would have been lower. But, we can split hairs on that.
I think the worse the better. The worse the better is almost never true, because you assure yourself worse, and then you have a theory of how that might produce better.
Yeah, that's fair. But now we have the benefit of hindsight, and we know that the mitigating the worst did not actually protect us from the worst, because we're living it now. So you know, either way.
I mean, it's kind of amazing watching what's happened over the last 3 months that the first Trump administration went as well as it did, especially on the economy, where you saw like a broadly, basically competent economic policy from the first Trump administration, which is why he was, you know, popular enough to almost win again and then to win 4 years later. I think if he didn't have that economic record, I think you're right that he would have been less competitive. I don't know whether that's because the personnel was better or because he was more inclined to listen to them. I mean, when Steve Mnuchin was picked in 2017, or maybe he was announced in 2016, he looked underqualified for the Treasury Secretary job. It was kind of like this, you know, he had been politically associated with Trump and was this kind of, you know, middling finance guy that had been picked for this job. He turned out to be very good at it. And I think, you know, partly because I think he was less egotistical than some of these other officials. He knew that he was maybe a little bit underqualified, and so he really listened to expert advice. And, you know, but anyway, he did a good job, and so did Gary Cohn. But Trump also clearly had a willingness to listen to them. And, you know, he had big ideas about tariffs that he repeatedly got talked out of during the first term. And so I think in significant part, there's been a big change in Trump, where he just is less interested in consensus advice, less interested in, you know, in listening to other people's guidance rather than his own wacky ideas that he's had about the economy for 50 years. So, I mean, I think Scott Bessent is a smart guy, and the stuff that he said about tariffs before the administration started made clear that Scott Bessent doesn't think the policies they're actually implementing now are good policies. I just think he doesn't have any juice. I don't think that, you know, I guess
I would say he's not very savvy. I'm not going to render a verdict on whether he's smart, but I've watched enough of his interviews now to know that he's not very savvy, and he comes off as extremely out of touch and affected, and his arguments are not particularly compelling. I mean, say what you want about J.D. Vance or Marco, like they're both pretty savvy at like navigating the, you know, Q&A around Trump's ridiculousness. Bessent seems totally incapable of handling that.
But there's no good way to market this tariff policy. I think that's, you know, an even more hopeless assignment than certain other aspects of the administration's policy. I mean, you know, even, you know, Marco and the immigration stuff, a lot of it is awful, but it's at least responding to a real political impulse in the United States where people were really unhappy with the level of, you know, of irregular immigration under Joe Biden, and like get tough on that is the thing that there's a big market for. The president's approval ratings are actually still a little bit above water on immigration. So like it's, you know, I think it's as an assignment in terms of go out and defend this awful thing. I think it's a lot easier with that than it is with this really idiotic tariff policy that is just going to make everybody poorer. And that's especially because Trump is so insistent on being so unpredictable about the tariffs, because he loves that. He loves that, you know, everyone is hanging on his every word, and people have to come into the Oval Office and beg him to make changes. And Tim Cook is there lobbying him all the time about, you know, please give me an exemption, et cetera, et cetera. Trump loves that. But that, you know, that just makes the tariff policy not only so much worse for the economy, it also makes it completely incapable of achieving the stated goals the Trump administration has here. This is not a policy that is, you know, that is designed such that it will actually foster the construction of factories in the United States, for example. So there's a version of the tariff policy that would have been large tariffs that are clearly telegraphed, and that are announced, and they stick to them. And it still would have been a bad policy, but at least you would have been able to explain what the hell you were doing. This, there's no available explanation for. So I don't think Steve Mnuchin would be doing a good job messaging it if he were here. I think the thing that you see, the demonstration that Steve Mnuchin is smart is that he didn't come back to serve in this administration. But I think Bessent has an impossible job.
So you're not as embittered as I am that the first gay Republican cabinet secretary is so hapless. That's fine.
Oh, it's not great.
I'm taking a little more personal.
But, you know, I mean, we are not a Borg. I'm not responsible for what Scott Bessent does because Scott Bessent is attracted to men. I mean, that's his problem.
I'm not responsible for it either. It's just it carries a little bit more. I don't know. There is a little bit more resentment. I don't know. So there's something.
Steve Myron is gay too. It's like
is this.
Yeah, it's this little gay mafia like implementing the worst economic policy of the last 90 years in the United States. It's not great for respectability politics. I get that, but I just think it's important for us to assert that we are all individuals
Yeah.
And the fact that some gay individuals are doing something stupid is not our fault or our responsibility.
I'm an individual and I share that. I just, as a gay individual, I'm also petty.
Yes.
So there's that. On the Dems, really quick on this, so I had Deluzio on. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about how the Dems, including him, were making some mistakes by trying to split the baby on this tariffs thing and talk about strategic tariffs. Just want to kind of let you cook on 2 minutes, but for 2 minutes on what you think the Dems should be doing on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think people need to remember that there's a difference between policies that poll well if you ask people about them and policies that will poll well if you actually implement them. I think that there's been a lot of broad, sort of free-floating discontent about NAFTA and the global economic system, and people talk about tariffs as something that's, supposed to protect the U.S., and that's a message that some voters find appealing. But now we're seeing tariffs actually get implemented, and they're already unpopular. They're especially unpopular with Democrats, and they're going to be even more unpopular in 6 months as the damage gets visited on the economy. And I think that's because tariffs are a bad idea. Once you implement them and people see what they do, it's going to be a toxic policy idea. And so I think for certain, reasons of populist messaging and for misunderstandings of economics, some Democrats have gotten relatively hostile to free trade over the last 15 years and have gotten some political mileage talking about trade restrictions being good. I think that's just out of date. As a political matter. It was always wrong as an economic matter. And now what you're seeing is, the vast majority of Democrats say tariffs are bad. I don't like tariffs. And so there's no reason for Democrats to be hedging on this issue. What they should say is Donald Trump is making you poorer and imposing a tax on you and cutting us off from the global economic system that has been, very important for upholding the U.S. economy. And we need to put that back together. So not only should we oppose Trump's tariffs, we should oppose tariffs generally. We should seek to rebuild our global economic alliances by entering into binding free trade agreements. I mean, we were supposed to have a trade policy that was built around isolating China because China is hostile for non-economic reasons. And so if you were going to do that, you needed to have friendly trade relations with Japan and Vietnam and all these countries that Trump is giving the middle finger to. The way you could put that back together is, you could have a free trade agreement that's built around isolating China. That's something that the Obama administration was negotiating. That was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then Bernie Sanders had his, anti-global elites messaging that Hillary Clinton felt the need to copy. And so you had Democrats turn against that stuff, and Trump obviously didn't want to do it. I think that's something that a next Democratic president should say, we're gonna build that stuff back together again. We're going to do a Trans-Pacific Partnership because we're going to rebuild our alliances in Asia and then similarly in Europe. I think that the time is ripe for Democrats to be the pro-global party, the country the party that wants the U.S. to remain at its position at the head of the global economic system. And I think that as Trump makes us poorer, I think that's going to become a popular thing. So I don't think there's a good reason for Democrats to hedge. I think it's worth noting, not all Democrats are hedging on this. I've been critical of what Congressman Deluzio has to say about this, but part of why Deluzio is notable is that he's been one of the figures in the party where not everybody's saying this. He's been saying this wrong thing. Jared Polis, gets an A, the governor of Colorado. He's, he talks about
Polis Hive podcast. So that's,
but I mean, he not only talks about Trump's tariffs are bad, but he talks about, voluntary trade makes both parties engaging in the trade richer. That's why people do trade. It's because you'd rather have the thing the foreign country has than have what you have. And so his messaging on this has been, really crisp and clear and, tying Trump's policies to a broader ideological idea of why we want to be open. And some of the other presidential hopefuls have been pretty good on this. J.B. Pritzker, has been very, clear on the messaging. Trump is imposing a tax on you. Both him and Josh Shapiro have been going to local businesses and saying, look at these vats in this brewery. Those are made of steel. Trump is imposing steel tariffs that will make that more expensive, make it harder to make beer here. The aluminum for the cans is going to be more expensive. They're really tying this to everyday business and consumer concerns. But I'd encourage them to think a little deeply about what that implies for other trade policies. Because it was interesting, Josh Shapiro was on with Stephanie Ruhle on MSNBC, and she used to be a business journalist over at Bloomberg. And she was asking Shapiro about, a lot of people are upset about what happened in the 90s in Pennsylvania with NAFTA. And Shapiro talks about, those trade deals, Pennsylvania workers got screwed by bad trade deals, but we're going to make good trade deals now, more or less. And so there's an inconsistency there because he's talking about today We need cheaper steel and cheaper aluminum so that businesses in Pennsylvania that use steel and aluminum can get it more cheaply. But the implication about the 90s, I mean, when people talk about NAFTA screwed people, what they mean is that U.S. steel workers ended up having to compete with steel workers from abroad selling cheaper steel. So in a way, he's having it both ways there. He's talking about, now we shouldn't have these metal tariffs, but the implication is the metal tariffs were good 30 years ago. I think you kind of need to admit that, a lot more people in the U.S. work in industries that consume steel and aluminum than in industries that make primary steel and aluminum. And so you want cheaper materials. There's, a few steel workers that'll be bad for, but there's a lot more auto workers that's good for. And I think we're about to get an object lesson in that makes clear that, if you have tariffs and they make auto parts more expensive, that's not going to protect the U.S. auto industry. It's actually going to make the U.S. auto industry less competitive. It's going to be bad for workers. But I think that you end up wanting a really clear, crisp pro-trade message there, because you end up with, not only are we friendlier with the world and not picking fights for no reason, we're also richer if we open ourselves up to trade.
All right. Well, you're flattering my priors on this. We'll see what Congressman Deluzio has to say about it in the next segment. The immigration stuff, I just want to talk about with you briefly, because you have a legal podcast. I want to get your legal take on what was happening yesterday in the Oval Office, where the El Salvador president, who to me looks like he has a lot of filler in his face. Not an expert on that, but that was just one observation I had from the self-styled world's coolest dictator. What did you make of the whole scene in there?
Yeah, I mean, I thought Ben Dreyfuss had this right, that Bukele is dressed like the manager of a Zara in the Valley, who goes to the food court and asks 19-year-old girls whether they've ever considered modeling.
That's creepy. That's a creepy image.
Yeah,
adult braces maybe.
But he looked creepy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's it just goes to show the craziness of the Trump administration foreign policy, where we're giving the middle finger to Europe and Japan and other rich country trading partners of ours, and also middle income countries like Mexico that we have deep economic ties to, and where we're building the deeper relationship is with El Salvador, a tiny, relatively poor country that cannot do that much for us. Like they can,
can house our prisoners extrajudicially, so that's pretty important.
Yeah, so that's that's clearly a top goal for them. It's gross. I mean, it was a gross scene, him there in the Oval Office, and I think look, El Salvador has been an absolute basket case for a long time, and I think if you are in El Salvador, there's an argument to be made that Bukele's administration has been better than the prior administration, because you basically had no rule of law in the country. And so, whatever, the manner in which that government is abusive is probably less abusive than the lack of governance regime.
Yeah, letting the gangs just slaughter people. Yeah.
But we are not a basket case or like that. And so the idea that we need this sort of, iron fist strongman to assist us is, obviously substantively crazy, but it appeals to Trump. And he wishes that he could be a leader like Bukele. But Bukele also has a really high approval rating because his administration is better for El Salvador than the prior one. Donald Trump is not bringing improvements for the United States. So that's why he doesn't have the kind of numbers that Bukele has.
Yeah. Well, I want to play for you, and put your legal podcast hat on, Stephen Miller in the Oval, explaining why the 9-0 loss that the administration took at the Supreme Court was actually a victory. Would like to hear your analysis of it.
And a district court judge tried to tell the administration that they had to kidnap a citizen of El Salvador and fly him back here. That issue was raised to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the district court order was unlawful, and its main components were reversed 9-0 unanimously, stating clearly that neither Secretary of State nor the President could be compelled by anybody to forcibly retrieve a citizen of El Salvador from El Salvador, who again is a member of MS-13, which, as I'm sure you understand, rapes little girls, murders women, murders children, is engaged in the most barbaric activities in the world, and I can promise you, if he was your neighbor, you would move right away.
Josh, what do you think about that legal analysis from the deputy president?
I mean, I think it's interesting that as this administration becomes more bold about disregarding court orders, they still feel the need to pretend that they are following the court orders. I mean, Stephen Miller could have gotten up there and just said, screw the Supreme Court, we're going to do what we want. He didn't. He instead chose to mischaracterize their ruling and say that they were complying with it, which they're not. on the other hand, the Supreme Court could have been a little more clearer than it was, and I think maybe they will be a little bit clearer the next time the case gets up to them. I think it'll be interesting to see what the administration does when there isn't the available fig leaf where they can, because the Supreme Court, for those who didn't look at the order closely, the district judge had ordered the government to facilitate and effectuate Kilmar's return to the United States. And what the Supreme Court said was they should facilitate it, but this district court needs to go back and say what they mean by effectuate, because you can't actually tell the government, you have to have a certain degree of deference to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign policy. And I think
so a good-natured semantic fight over a man's life at the highest level of the Supreme Court. That's nice.
Right.
What does the word effectuate mean?
Right. And the Supreme Court can come back, and I think quite possibly will end up having to come back to give, more detailed instructions to the U.S. government about what it should do here. The obvious fact on the matter is that if we wanted this guy back, we would have him back. The government of El Salvador is quite pliant to the Trump administration, as you saw from him in the Oval Office. And if Trump, it's literally true that we cannot extract an El Salvadoran citizen from El Salvador without the consent of the government of El Salvador. But the obvious thing is that we would get the consent of the government of El Salvador if we actually wanted it.
We're also paying them.
Right. Yeah. And that's the other thing. So that's another way that the courts might end up intervening here, is they can say, you can't send money to El Salvador for this. And that's a domestic thing, even though there's the foreign policy component here. So I think we're not quite done with this case and the Supreme Court and seeing what the administration will do. There's been a lot of desire on the part of the conservative justices on the court to treat the Trump administration like an essentially normal presidential administration, where the U.S. government generally gets a lot more deference than other litigants when it's before the Supreme Court. And I think that that was an unreasonable view on their part to begin with, but it's becoming increasingly untenable. And I don't know the extent to which they actually believed that, or they wanted to, they don't want to be crosswise with Trump or whatever, versus that they felt that that's the position the court has to start from. That, you have to, we're dealing with the U.S. government, and the first thing we have to do is act like they are a normal good faith litigant and see what happens. But I think it's becoming clear that they're not only becoming clear, but becoming, impossible to look away from the fact that they're not a good faith litigant. And so I don't know exactly what the court is going to do as the administration increasingly gives them the finger. But I think, one possibility is that the court is going to, set itself up to be more adverse to them in the long run.
God willing. All right. Last topic. You're a graduate of Harvard. You never talked about that. You never mentioned that. But Harvard is in the news recently. And I'm just wondering how you feel about your alma mater telling the Trump administration to pound sand. They were not going to cut a deal with them like Columbia did and change their hiring practices, et cetera. What do you make of this story?
Well, I think it's a good thing that Harvard did. I think that the list of demands that the administration sent to them was unworkable. And in some cases contradictory. I mean, the government told them to, stop doing, hiring practices that are based on, characteristics. And then another one that says basically you need to hire more conservatives. But I think the other thing,
skin color characteristics only. Okay, very specific characteristics you're allowed to hire from.
But the other thing about this is that the list of demands was quite different from the list of demands that was sent to Columbia, and more expansive. And then also when Columbia said, okay, fine, we're going to do what you tell us to do, instead of saying, okay, thank you, Columbia, for complying with our demands, they just sent more demands to Columbia. And so it's different from what's gone on with the law firms, where the administration seems eager to cut these deals with big law firms. And a lot of the deals with the law firms kind of look like the administration isn't actually demanding that much from them. They have to say that they're going to follow employment law, which they already had to do. They have to do certain pro bono work in certain areas, but those areas are quite broadly defined, such that, if the law firm has to do pro bono work supporting veterans and fighting anti-Semitism, maybe they were doing some of that work already. They can recategorize that, or maybe, there are areas of sufficiently shared interest that it's not a gross thing for them to be doing. And regardless of whether or not the firms are right about this,
well, I would just say the deals always get worse with Trump.
Right.
For the law firms, so we'll see what's coming. But
we'll see what's coming. But there's a non-crazy case to be made internally at the firms that we're not really agreeing to very much here. the list of demands that they sent to Harvard, there was no way to say, well, gee, we're not really agreeing to very much here. It was basically subjecting Harvard's whole, their academic decisions to politicians in the U.S. government and letting them tell them who to hire and which departments to need to be diversified ideologically and all sorts of things. It was a list of demands that looks to me like it was written to get a no from Harvard. If they wanted a yes, they could have written a list of demands that was designed to get to yes in the way that they have done with the law firms. But what I think the administration wants the fight with universities, and Harvard is exceptionally well financially resourced. So they're in an especially good position to say no. But I think that, this looks to me like the administration is not actually trying to get the universities to heal, but is trying to get to this fight with the universities. They want them to say no, and they've sent such an expansive list of demands because it is designed to get a no out of them.
Yeah, sometimes, it's best just assume that they have like totally incompetent, crazy people who would never be anywhere near power writing these sorts of things. And so, it maybe doesn't make sense to come up with post hoc rationalizations for it. But if your argument is right, and I think there's something to be said for it, they want this fight with the universities. I think the flip side of that coin is maybe they don't want the fight as much with the law firms, because what they really want is the chilling effect on these law firms, like representing future whistleblowers, et cetera, right? Like they would rather like have the deal and get these people in the tent, so to speak. I mean, maybe that's a little overstated, but rather, like that's of greater value than the PR fight. Is that possible?
I think it's possible, although I think it remains to be seen how effective the law firm strategy is about denying representation to people that the administration doesn't want represented. Law is such a fragmented industry, and there are so many law firms out there, and there are litigation boutiques that are less that rely less on a positive relationship with the government as compared to these giant firms that do a lot of M&A and other things where it's they go in and meet with government officials, and it's important that everyone be nice. And so I think it's possible that they have made it significantly harder for people to get lawyers to fight the administration, but I think it's also possible that they haven't actually made it that much harder, and that the representations will just sort of be shuffled around in terms of which firms they go to. So I don't know whether it's true that the administration has actually gotten a lot out of the law firm fight, other than getting people to make a show of deference to the president, which I think he personally values a lot. I think he likes the fact that these powerful, managing partners of these law firms have to come to the Oval Office and beg him for something. But I also think that they could have demanded more from the law firms and still gotten some of them to say yes. I think that if they were really trying to put the screws, they would have made the list of demands sufficiently onerous that you would have had some firms saying yes and some saying no. And I think that they would enjoy the show of causing one of these law firms to go bankrupt. I mean, if you have one of these firms that stands up to the administration and wins in court, but their clients for M&A and antitrust and other things where they're really relying on a relationship with the government, if those fall away and the attorneys in those practice areas fall away, I mean, you could see these firms blowing up, especially since the administration is also pushing us into a recession. That was already bad for the legal business. So I think I would have expected them to want that. I think they would have wanted a big, high-profile law firm implosion, and I think they may well have been able to cause one. I mean, and maybe it'll happen to one of the handful of firms that's fighting them, but I think that generally the firms that are fighting know that their business is different and they're not as exposed as the firms that folded. Anyway, I think I'm a little bit surprised by what they've done with the law firms, because I would have expected the administration to sort of welcome that fight more and actually try to make demands such that some of them would have said no in the way that they've done with the universities. I don't know entirely what to make of it.
Josh Barro, thank you for your centenarian facts. I hope you enjoyed Gaga and Amara
she was fabulous.
As much as I did.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
So good.
Did you have another favorite set?
I love Charlie. Charlie XCX. It's, she has such a presence. She's just up there on, like, Gaga has dozens of backup dancers and had this amazing lush production. Charlie's just up there by herself, holding a red Solo cup in one hand and the microphone in the other. And she manages in her like messy, chaotic way to command this giant stage. I think it's really impressive, and it was a super fun set.
Hard to argue. And you're probably more Brat than Kamala, I would say, as well.
Well, I mean, Nobody's more brat than Donald Trump.
Is that true? Oh no, Josh. Now you're in trouble.